Gauser and Associates. I'm working with the Drucker Institute, Lawrence Greenspun. We're working with the city on the development of South Bend 2045, their comprehensive plan. We have a speaker series as well as workshops that we've been doing on that. Some of the workshops around themes, some are around city departments, some are around city organizations or organizations in the city. Some of you have participated in those workshops. A significant part of that is a speaker series. And to cap off today's great symposium on housing, we have Joshua McCarty with Urban 3, who's going to be our speaker. He's the second speaker in the series with the South Bend 2045. You can read his bio. He's got a degree in economics from UNC Asheville and a master in city and regional planning. But the thing that is interesting about Urban 3, I've been working in municipal finance for a very long time, and I had the privilege of seeing the Urban 3 presentation about 3 or 4, 5 months ago, and I had never, ever seen anything like it. These guys have a way of visualizing land use planning and city finance that is powerful and interesting and will be of great utility here in South Bend. So, Josh, you're on.
Thank you for that warm greeting. Is this mic coming through okay? Okay. Oops, skipped ahead here. Good evening. It's really nice to be back here in South Bend. It's my second time back here, and a lot of the work I'm going to show tonight is work that we did at Urban 3 back in 2019, and I thought we would be showing in 2020, but as we all know, 2020 had different plans. And so here I am now, like so many concerts, just 2 years late. And I wanted to, if you'll indulge me, I wanted to share a little story about my own experience with the housing crisis. So this is where my family and I hunkered down for the lockdown. We all worked from home. There was my office where I did some of this work, and my wife worked from home, and even my hound dog worked from home. And at the end of this thing, one of the things that I've noticed today, or that we've all been talking about today, is the way that big, complicated systems reverberate throughout society and have an impact on people and have an impact on housing, and sometimes intentionally or not so, or unintentionally or sometimes not so unintentionally can harm people. And so this is what happened to us. Cities and public entities all around the country have an obligation to pay pensions, but they often don't have all of the money on hand to pay those pension checks, so the pension funds have to invest that money. So they, in the last decade or so, have been buying lots and lots of multifamily housing, including the one that I lived in, and so my family had to leave as a result of that, and that was very difficult and upsetting. And so one of the points I wanted to make with this, other than just getting to know each other a little better, is that this housing crisis is affecting everyone. And my wife specifically wanted me to tell all of you that she's a professor of occupational therapy, and 3/4 of her advisees are facing housing insecurity. And so these are graduate students preparing themselves for a career in healthcare. And so what I want to do for the next hour or so is use maps and data visualizations and storytelling to try to explain and understand a little better how those big, complicated systems work and what effect they have on our cities. And so, because I'm going to go through a lot of topics, I'll give you an idea of some of the things we're going to be talking about. Basically, I call these questions we can answer with a map. So, how does South Bend generate its revenue? What kind of development is actually profitable and financially viable for the city? What are the impacts of a lot of things we've talked about today, like redlining, look like in this data? And what are some of the policies that are still actively creating harm? sort of the legacy and vestigial impact of redlining. So, when we talk about a city, what are we talking about? How do we describe a city? So we like to go back to this original definition of a city as a municipal corporation. So cities are a special kind of corporation. They provide public goods, the kind of things we don't necessarily want people to compete for. But like a private corporation, they have to make sure that they generate enough revenue to be able to meet their obligations and provide good quality services to people. And so another way that we like to conceptualize that is to think about how farmers think about their crops and fields. So in the same way that a farmer might look at different sized fields and different crops and think about the inputs and the revenue per acre that he gets from his fields, that's how we want to try to think about cities and their crop of development. And so this work that we do, looking at the economics of cities at Urban 3, grew out of the work that our predecessor, or excuse me, that's my note to make sure that I'm here on time. And so the work that they were doing was to rehabilitate historic buildings in Asheville and provide business loans to get tenants in those buildings. And one of the things that they noticed is that their tax bill would go way, way up when they did this, which was fine. They were good citizens, happy to pay it. But one of the things that was missing is that the city didn't really understand this and wasn't seeing the benefit they were providing, because so much of our understanding or the prevailing wisdom about economic development and prosperity looks like things like this. That's a Walmart. And the reason is because it has a really big tax bill, $20 million tax bill versus the $11 million for our downtown building. So what we'll try to do, just like the farmers' crops, is compare these. And so the thing that's missing from the equation is that Walmart takes up 34 acres of our municipal corporation, including all the infrastructure that has to go with it, versus 0.2 acres for our downtown building. And so we put it in terms of value per acre and take into account all that area. Now we can see that it's an order of magnitude different, that our downtown building produces much more taxes per acre. The same is true for retail taxes. And if we think about other forms of efficiency, there's more space to house our residents and more space to house jobs on this site. So it's a simple comparison, but it's an important one. And so in Oregon, if we're talking about a farm analogy, we can make it really simple and say, which crop would you rather grow? Okay, so here's another way to think about it. When we shop for cars, we typically aren't that concerned with how many miles you can get to the tank. I made this relevant for the South Bend crowd. And so if we would go with an F-150 if we didn't expect to find a gas station anywhere close. But we're typically more concerned with the miles per gallon, because that's the measure of efficiency, and fuel is the finite, expensive resource, in which case we would go with this weird three-wheeled car from the 50s. Now, if we were going for style, I'm pretty sure the Commander would win. Okay, so let's take this idea and try to apply it to city finances. So here's where South Bend was getting its revenue from in 2019. And so the part that we're mostly concerned with is this side over here, the pieces of revenue that are spatially relevant that we can put on a map, and the pieces that specifically pay for infrastructure, because as we move along, we're going to talk about the cost of development as well. And so, And so this is what the miles per tank approach looks like for South Bend, just the total tax value of property. And it doesn't tell us a very compelling story, because basically things that are bigger are just worth more, especially if they have something commercial or industrial on them. But we take into account the value per acre, suddenly we see a pattern that tells us more information. But still, though, the things that are really important are small, so it's a lot easier to see in 3D. And now that we put it in 3D, we can suddenly see where the potent value is coming from in the community. And we can see the importance of downtown and new development around Notre Dame. And so we did this work, we did this project looking at revenue in 2015, and then we were invited to come back in 2019 to expand on that and look at costs and look at the impact of redlining. And so because of that, we're able to look at what changed in between the two. And so St. Joseph County added about $1 billion in value, most of which was through reassessment and appreciation of existing property. But there are some prominent changes that we can see in the downtown, and especially this new stuff coming online around Notre Dame. And so here's just a closer in view of the city so we can see a little bit better what's going on, and how the city of South Bend has changed in that time period. One of the things we like to do is, one of the things that comes out of this work is trying to help communities understand the importance of their downtown and how much value is being produced in it. So here's just the downtown isolated within the city. And so it takes up about 1% of its land area, but produces 4% of its tax value. So it's overperforming compared to the rest of the city, which is basically a 1-to-5 ratio, which is pretty good. It's overperforming. But what we typically like to see, or sort of the average that we're seeing across communities, is about 1 to 6. So, and that makes some sense. There's still some legacy of urban renewal, and there's still space to expand the downtown. But here's what's even more interesting. When we compare that to the county, it's a tiny, tiny piece of land, tiny fraction of land area, and it's 1% of the tax value, which 1% may not seem like a big number, but it's such a small area of land it makes for a 1-to-22 ratio. So the lesson there is that what happens in the downtown is really beneficial to the city, but it's phenomenally beneficial to the county. And so the county should understand this and see that what happens in the downtown can have this outsized impact for the whole community. Okay, so these maps can be a little abstract, and not everybody reads a map that way. So what we like to do is to basically put some faces to these spikes in the model and look at actual development in the community and how it performs. So we like to start out with two types of development that are ubiquitous in American communities: single-family housing and Walmart, because almost every community has a Walmart, and all Walmarts are pretty much the same. So what we'll do, and it makes for a really nice benchmark to be able to compare how do things perform against a Walmart. And so we'll leave that number down in the corner, $500,000. So we have our other big box auto-oriented development. Interestingly, all pretty much the same, about $500,000 an acre. And that's in large part because of the way what value is there is so diluted by the amount of parking. What we find, I've condensed some of the examples in here for time, but overall what we find is the more things you put on the same amount of land, the more dense it is, the more compact and the better designed it is, the value increases not just linearly, but exponentially. And so when we look at townhouses in the community, we can see that it's order of magnitude greater than the Walmart, $3 million to $6.5 million an acre. And so that's a big jump from the auto-oriented stuff. This is a particularly fun example that I found. Things have changed a little. I took this in 2015. It's fun. And I was wondering, I walked through this today actually, because I was wondering if it still looked like this, because this is kind of surprising to me. It's called something else now, so it looks nicer now, so it's probably worth more. But this is something like $13 million an acre, and literally right next to it is this drive-through bank with a parking lot at $379,000 an acre. So something isn't working quite right in the development scenario of the city when two pieces of land next to each other can have two radically different decisions about what to do with that land. And so another way that we really like to make this point is to look at the opportunity cost. And so this is actually a building in Mishawaka, but there's plenty of examples like this in South Bend too, and it wouldn't be hard to build a new one. It's just a 3-story brick box. But if you had an acre of this kind of development, it would produce as much property tax revenue as this entire 14-acre Kmart. And I bet that's not, I'm guessing it's not even a Kmart anymore. I'm guessing right now it's a Halloween superstore. And so, okay, so, these townhouses, if you had 7 acres of this, you'd have the same tax production as this 57-acre shopping center. So it's really just, making this point about how compact development can really outperform and how you can use this space better, especially when we get to the part about impervious surfaces. Okay, so the relative value per acre is really important, but the other lesson that's really important and fun is to think about how long the durability of tax production in different properties. So we know that big box stores like Walmart typically have a shelf life of about 15 to 20 years, maybe 25 at the most, before, they're literally designed to depreciate and then be torn down and moved. Whereas you have buildings in your community, just like most communities, that have been paying property tax for a century. And so we'll look at some of those. One of the frustrating things, though, which maybe plays out in that downtown ratio, is that so much of your architectural heritage and also financial bedrock has been, taken from you through urban renewal and demolition. And so just to make a point about that, and it's not always, we don't always think about the loss in tax revenue that goes with that, but we have this example that survived, the Lafayette at $11 million an acre. These 2 old hotels are gone, but it makes us wonder what might they have produced if they had survived. And likewise, this beautiful gem of a building on your skyline comes in at $13 million an acre, and it's been producing that value for almost 100 years. So we've talked about the revenue side, and I'll add too, we looked at more than just the property tax revenue, but for the sake of time, I kind of condensed it, and I'll just say that those patterns basically follow the same patterns what we see with property tax. So now in 2019, we got to look at the cost side to try to figure out, okay, how do different developments perform relative to each other in a net return on investment basis? So here's where South Bend was spending its money, roughly, in 2019. And so the pieces that we were really interested in are infrastructure, and especially things that are spatially relevant. And so we wanted to do sort of an infrastructure audit to see, one, can South Bend afford what it has right now with what it's paying? And then where specifically can we find net revenue production? And so in that discussion, one of the peculiarities of our government accounting systems in America is this idea that roads are assets. I call it the accounting footnote that bankrupted America. And here's why I think that is because when we think about assets in a business, usually it's very easy to think about the ones that we have in our business: equipment, vehicles, property. These are all things that have pretty predictable values, and you can go and sell them and they can be traded. Whereas roads, there's not really a market for them, and there's not really a set price for them. All they really do is break. So in reality, they should probably be treated as liabilities. So when we're thinking about assets and the way that we account for them, we like to use this example from just what happens in private real estate or private development is, in this case, we've got this mall here, and there's this gigantic air conditioner that is being replaced. And if we know that it's going to cost $85,000, and we know it's going to cost $35,000 to drag it over there with a helicopter, and we know it's going to take 15 to 20 years before it has to be replaced, we know that over the next 20 years, we should probably set aside something like $205,000, so that at the end of that time period, we have money to be able to do it. But this isn't necessarily what we do in our cities, and it's really not what we do when cities, and this isn't just a South Bend issue, this is what we're finding everywhere in the country, is that we aren't taking that approach to our infrastructure. And so here's what that would look like for a road. So when a road gets built, there's all of the stuff you have to do to it in the course of a year, so snow plowing and painting stripes, all that sort of thing. Then there are the more substantial things you have to do. Every 10 years or so, it's going to need some rehabilitation, which has a substantial cost. And then the big thing happens. At the end, depending on how good a job you do with this stuff, between 20 and 60 years, even if you do a good job with this, sooner or later, it's going to have to be reconstructed. And one of the issues that we are running into in our cities, if we don't stretch the timeline out far enough to reach this, we have an unrealistic idea of what our infrastructure costs. And so this is called a life cycle approach to infrastructure. And so what we'll do is take all of this money that has to be spent over, say, 50 years and divide it out by those 50, just like the air conditioners, so that we know every single year how much money should we have on hand to be able to deal with our road system. So back when we did this project, we were estimating it at something like 40 cents a square foot, which I can say now is as just like everything else has gone up. Price of asphalt, I think, doubled this year alone. So that's the way that we are considering infrastructure cost, this life cycle, annual life cycle number. Okay, in a more just general sense, here's how we like to conceptualize the relationship between infrastructure and development. Chuck Marone at Strong Towns has a really good way of explaining this, and he talks about two kinds of road or street, which is street and road. A street is, the job of a street is to create value in the development that it supports, and likewise, depends on the development it supports to generate enough revenue to pay for it. So in this example, we have a modest, narrow, not that expensive street, and we have a lot of valuable development to try and pay for it. So we've got a good chance that this can be covered. Now, at the other end of the spectrum is a road that takes you from one place to another. This job is mobility. But in the middle is this sort of hybrid thing that he calls a strode that has a lot of cost, a lot of big, wide infrastructure, but it doesn't have all of that substantial, valuable development around it to be able to pay for it. And so this is a situation that's very precarious and can start to drain the financial resiliency of a city. Okay, so what does this look like in South Bend? So here is your road system. You have about 500 miles of road, which is enough road to go to Knoxville. So another way to think about it is this is what you get to maintain in South Bend, is you get to make sure that this road that goes to Knoxville is taken care of every year. And so if we squished them all into a big parking lot, this is to scale, it'd be about 3 square miles of parking or road surface. And the punchline is you should be coming up with something like $44.5 million a year to be able to make sure that this is in good shape after 50 years or so. So to put that in perspective, because I don't think most people have in their head, how many miles of road do other cities have? We'll do a little comparison with other places. And one of the things that's sort of unique, this is going to come up a few times in presentation, is there's sort of two versions of our numbers for South Bend because of this big change that happened. And so in 1960, when you had your peak population, you had one of the most manageable road burdens of any of the places we've looked at. But because you lost population and expanded your road network, now there's a lot more road burden per person. But I don't want you to feel too bad about this. Just because you're the worst on this chart, I haven't totally updated the chart yet. There are some worse places. We'll talk about some of those there. Most of them are in the Sun Belt, and they're going to be feeling this pain later down the road. In a lot of ways, South Bend's just kind of ahead of the rest of America, is just built suburbs first. Okay, and so here's how South Bend got there. So this is 1930, when you had about 100,000 people, and this is what your road network looked like. We throw Mishawaka in there too for fun. And this is what it looked like in 1960, when after 30 years of rapid growth and at peak population. And here's 2020. So South Bend didn't expand its roads too much in that time period, but you can see the proliferation of road network around South Bend. And so here's part of the dilemma that South Bend faces, is that peak population is here in 1963, and now we basically have, we're back to the same number of people we had around 1930, but with twice as much road. And so that's a burden that South Bend has to deal with. Sorry. Okay, and so put this another way. We went back and we tried to estimate how much road revenue there would be. We really don't know how that worked back in this time period, but we just took the way it works now and applied it backwards to get a sense of how this gap between the money you have and the need has diverged over time. Okay, so what does that $44 million look like in context? So here's the revenue and expenses from 2019, and we estimated that South Bend was spending something like $15 million a year on its road system, which leaves a need of $32 million. And so where that which you can see just based on the size there, is substantial. And so where that manifests itself is in deferred maintenance, and in most cities it comes to a point where it leads to borrowing. And so we'll go back to our road to Knoxville for a second. So if we have our road to Knoxville we need to maintain, we're only going to make it to Scottsburg, Indiana. You don't quite make it to Kentucky. There we go. Oops. Okay. So yet another way. I'm giving you sort of a few different versions of how this looks to try to make sense of it. And so what we did too is we went and we tried to estimate when all of your roads were built. So here's the miles of road that come online in all the years leading up to 2019 or 2020. And so here we are in the present, well, what was the present. And so what happens, see if you can see this, is all those roads that were built back in 1980, they show up again in 2020 when they need to be rebuilt. And all of them need to be rebuilt. And guess what? All of those roads built back in 1940 also have to be rebuilt, and then they have to be rebuilt again. So the point is that this rebuild cycle is perpetual. Once roads are built, they don't go away. Well, they could go away, but if you want to keep them maintained as roads, they don't go away. They continue to have that cost forever, and that cost will compound as more and more roads are built. So what's happening in a lot of cities in the United States, oh, there was one more rebuild cycle, is that when we get to these points where all of the roads that were built in abundance in the 1950s and 60s are starting to come due, and a lot of cities are facing this huge burden. And so if we go back to our pie wheel of the budget and we drop an extra $32 million in there to keep the roads going, it's a pretty substantial piece of the pie. In fact, it'd be a little bit like adding an extra police force. And so, excuse me. Just like the roads, the pipes, your pipe infrastructure follows the same pattern. You've got enough, if we lead them together, you've got enough water pipe to go to Little Rock, and if we added the sewer pipe after that, you almost make it to Mexico. You got about 1,200 miles of both kinds of pipe. And here's how South Bend got to that point. So we made this little animation of pipes being built over time. Something fun's going to happen in 1960 around where we hit peak population. So we drew a boundary there about where you stopped really adding people, but the infrastructure continued to get built. And so we've got decades of expanding pipe infrastructure without necessarily having growth. And part of that is some incentives, or some perceived incentives about what revenue can do outside city boundaries. And so another source of expanding infrastructure is to make this point about how this has expanded over time, is back in 1960, you only had 3 lift stations. So a lift station is basically a pump. It's expensive to run, and it's even more expensive to replace. And so there were 3 of them back then, and by 2020, there were 43 of them. 43 of them. And you can see too that some of them, I think, are justifiable because they do work for the entire pipe system. But these up here, as you can see, are mostly correlated or mostly are serving new development. And that's more about the way that developers, most of these I think were built by developers for developments and then donated to the city. Such a fun word, isn't it? Donated. It's kind of like someone giving you a free car every year as long as you maintain it. Okay. So we've talked so far about costs in the aggregate. What I want to do now is talk a little bit about what we tried to do, estimating these costs and revenues at the parcel level or development level, so we get a sense of the relative performance of different developments. So what we did is we took the revenues that we looked at, and here they are mapped in the positive, and we took our costs, so infrastructure cost, and we put those down here red in the negative, so we can see what they look like next to each other. And then we subtracted them out. So now we get a sense of the net revenue production on every parcel. Are you producing more than you're consuming? And so as we can see, there's a difference. Some are, some aren't. And some of the ones that are really are. So let's turn this sideways so we can get a sense of what's going on. One of the things that really stands out is that there are relatively few properties that are actually positive, and the ones that are tend to be very positive. But meanwhile, there's a lot of red around the city. And so if we look at it from below, so turn it upside down, look at it upside down, what we can see is there's lots and lots of very small deficits scattered all around the city. Sometimes we call this a death by 1,000 cuts. And as we'll see later on, that's pretty strongly connected to a single family and suburban model of development. And so when we look at just the roads, this is road net model for South Bend. South Bend can afford about half of its road network. And so just to put that in perspective, I don't want to give you the idea that, even with all of the challenges that South Bend's faced, that it's really that special of a case. This is something that's endemic in American cities. And so here are some of the other cost models that we've looked at. This is Lancaster, California, which is totally different history than South Bend. Very new city, very Sunbelt, rapid growth city, and can afford less than half of its road system. Lafayette, Louisiana, less than half of its road system, and that's generous, honestly. We did this so long ago that I think the cost numbers were way low. The closest we've seen to a city that can afford its infrastructure was Eugene, Oregon, and they have both a more compact development model than most American cities because it's Pacific Northwest, and they also have more options for generating revenue. They can charge their own local gas tax, for instance. And so we look at a bunch of the cities where we've done this work, you can see none of them are positive. And one of the things that I'm making a point of saying when I present this information now is that I do not believe that a single American community can pay for its infrastructure. I don't think anyone can, not with the way we do things now. Okay, so now that we've looked at the cost, now we can start looking at, okay, what are the typologies that are producing more revenue than they consume in infrastructure? So what we did to kind of generalize this is we took a matrix of kinds of development, residential, mixed use, and commercial, and then ranges of density to see how do these different things perform. And what we find is that the more compact, the more dense, the more stuff that's available to pay for that infrastructure, just like a little example with the narrow street and the townhouses, the more financially viable it is for the city. And the other thing that's kind of interesting or is notable is that there's only one negative on this list, and it's the single family housing or low density residential. So this is averaged out across all of the residential. And even though it's negative $2,000, which is substantial, but what's really alarming about that is that if those are the options in your portfolio, this is where your portfolio is invested. And so based on land area, it's half of your land area is single family, which means that this much of the city is running an average of this much deficit. So another way that we like to think about that, or you could think about it, is that the United States has had one primary model of building affordable housing for the last century, which is to subsidize the infrastructure and find some other way to pay for the infrastructure or not pay for the infrastructure to make this possible. Okay, stormwater infrastructure is particularly important here in South Bend because you have a combined sewer system. And so in addition to the direct cost of it, there's the cost of the scary, undesirable thing that happens when that system gets overwhelmed. And so the basic unit of stormwater is impervious surface. So rain falls from the sky, hits something it can't go through, and it becomes runoff and can cause problems. And when we're thinking about that, the rain doesn't care whether it falls on a drive-in movie theater or whether it falls on a 100-story luxury condo building, but the tax assessor does. So what we did here is we took our value per acre model and we colored it based on how impervious it is. So what we want to see is if we're going to have impervious surface, we want it to be paying for itself. What we don't want to see is impervious surface that isn't really producing a lot of value. Like this is just pure parking. So when we're talking about impervious surface and stormwater, another thing that often gets overlooked, and especially when we're talking about parking lots, is remember this 3 square mile parking lot of road network that the city has? This is a cost that's often overlooked when we're thinking about stormwater. And if that cost is distributed out to the outlying parts of the city, then it means that stormwater should be distributed along with it. So what we did is we divided up these figures of the elements of your impervious surface to see what does a development model look like for an individual person. And it's a pretty familiar picture. A 1,000 square foot building, 2 parking spaces, a driveway, and a strip of road. It's kind of, it's something you wouldn't have to look hard to find in most American cities. But the thing that's important about this is when we look at the values of all these things, this has a cost that has to be overcome. So whatever's built here has to be able to support that or it will fail. Parking has really minimal value. Its value is essentially the land that it sits on. It's buildings where all of the money comes from, which is exactly why in our value per acre model, what we're finding is the more of this you can get on a site and the less of this other stuff, the more profitable it's going to be. And so here's what your roads look like, and the parking, and the buildings. And so we'll take that and we'll just squish it into a bunch of squares so we can see how South Bend allocates its space. And so we break it up by land use versus value. We can see that there's some things, that, backyards, fields, forests drops off significantly. It's just a bunch of open land. It's buildings that have this outsized impact on everything. But the other thing that stands out to us when we look at that is that it's kind of interesting too that the road and parking are about the same amount of space, which makes sense. Cars need a place to go while they're sleeping, and the cars need a place to go while they're running, right? They need a home for both times a day. But what's interesting is we know what the roads cost. We know they have a cost that can't be avoided, but we charge so much less for what's happening while they're sleeping. So I don't know, maybe it's a crazy idea, but it seems like these two should be better linked. Or put another way, isn't that spatial? Okay, little church lady for you. Okay, so another example we like to talk about is to just go and let's find some different developments in the city and see how they perform against each other. So we made this little diagram to help explain how decisions about development directly impact the cost. And so what we did is we took 4 houses worth $200,000. We even gave an advantage to the bigger lots because they have a little more land, so they're worth a little more. But what we said is this strip of road in front of each one of these houses have to pay for that. And so what happens is the more frontage you have, the more the road has to be stretched out, and so the higher everyone's bill is. So if we charge this road bill to all 4 of these houses, the bill per house goes from $200 to $158 to $100 down to $26 when we get, these two are the exciting ones, once they're touching each other and then once they're stacked on top of each other. So there's a direct benefit to compactness when it comes to affordability and being able to cover the infrastructure. You also get a very different size city based on these dimensions than these dimensions. So we went and tried to find sort of an example of that in the city. So here's a neighborhood, a traditional gridded neighborhood built around the 30s. And here's a nice curvy lollipop neighborhood from 1970s. Anybody recognize these places and lives there? Sorry. Okay, so we'll compare how their costs and revenues do against each other. So here's our 70s neighborhood. Kind of turn it into a diagram here. There's buildings and roads. And so what we'll do is start adding up the yearly costs for all the stuff in these neighborhoods. So I mean, $75,000 a year for the roads, 11 for the pipes, 35 for the stormwater and sewer pipes, and oops, that went off the screen, but I know what the number is. It's negative $100,000. Well, it's $100,000 anyways. And, oh, there it is, okay. And this neighborhood produces about $20,000 a year to be able to pay for that. So that is a net negative of $100,000. Well, let's see how the other one does. So the difference between these is that this one has less road in it. And so $38,000 for the roads, 12 for the pipes, 28 for the stormwater and sewer, grand total $78. So, and we specifically picked two neighborhoods that were pretty similar in terms of value as well. So, and also about $22,000. So here's how they look next to each other. We get down to it, 88 houses. Punchline is it's negative. This one's still a deficit of $50,000, but it's still, oops, sorry. It's still half as much of the deficit of this one. So just in just like in our diagram, as you change the dimensions of the neighborhood, you're better able to afford the infrastructure that it sits on. Okay, so one of the things I didn't want to leave out is there's all this development peripheral to South Bend, and so this area, I don't know exactly what to call it, but I was looking at it and I really wanted to see how it would compare, is if we pretended that was a city, or what if it had incorporated. So I called it Michiana. And so there it is, the brand new city in Indiana, and here's how it compares. It's actually almost the exact same land area as South Bend, and it's got half as many people, and you've got 500 miles of road, but they've got 327. So when we divide that out by person, like we did in the very beginning, well, guess what? You were worst on our list. Michiana's way worse on our list. They have about 900 square feet of road per person they have to deal with. And since you're further along in those maintenance, in the deterioration of your roads in the life cycle, in a few decades, this is going to start to become a big problem for the county. In fact, if the county wasn't able to also get revenue from South Bend, it would be an even bigger problem. So there's kind of a weird incentive to never incorporate if you're Michiana. Okay, and so now that we've laid this groundwork and we've talked about cost and revenue and introduced you to the ways that we like to show this, now what I want to do is show you some of what past policy looks like in our model. And so I counted, this is about the 7th time this map has come up today in our talks. And it was didn't explain very well, so I'll go through it quickly. But we know there's the redlining maps, which really is I think of it as an umbrella for lots of other policies that had the same effect. And we know that some of the outcomes of that, like the concentration of poverty and segregation, and impacts on property values, which is something that we can see. And so it's just, here's an example of sort of hateful language that was written into these things. And so what we also can see is that there's a big difference in property value and value per acre between different neighborhoods in South Bend, which is very correlated with the old redlining maps. And so here's land value. There's a pretty stark difference in land value between two sides of the city. So darker color is higher land value per acre. And so what we did here is we took the value per acre model, so property value per acre, and we colored it by the redlining grades, so we could try to see whether there's an average effect between these. And it's not a perfect correlation. Of course, I learned today that these weren't even the real maps. I'm still kind of thinking about that there were other maps that were the real ones. But we do see there is an effect that there's a lower average value per acre in the neighborhoods that were excluded from the financial system. And so one of the other big impacts that we're able to see from this is the loss of housing and vacancy. So I found an example that's a little like my diagram. It would be better if it were lined up 0, 1, 2, but I'll work with it. And so these are 3 houses that have their same dimensions, same lot size, same frontage, and they have the same infrastructure in front of them. But the difference is in what revenue is available to pay for that infrastructure, how many families and households are able to pay for that infrastructure. And this is a big concern because there's no revenue that comes from this, or only very nominal revenue. And so if we have lots that don't generate revenue, but they still are served by infrastructure, we have to look at how many of those there are around the city. And so we'll go back to our ROI model for a minute, turn it over, and so of all of those, there's all of the 1,000 cuts underneath the model. These are all just vacant lots. So these are ones that had houses, now they don't, but South Bend is still responsible for the infrastructure. When we add that up, it's something like $2.5 million a year to serve these vacant lots with infrastructure. So it's even more urgency to do something with those and get them online again. Okay, so one of the things that the old Hulk maps did for us is that, so here's a neighborhood, here's a heavily redlined area that I've heard mentioned several times today. One of the old redlining maps, in addition to making commentary on how people looked, also collected some data that's useful to us, like property values. And so we have old values from this time period that we can adjust for inflation. So this is a thought experiment, but we wanted to try to get a number to figure out how much value might have been lost from that decision. And so here's the neighborhood as it is. So what we did is we just took that $90,000, or for each district what the average adjusted for inflation value was, and we put back the houses that are just gone, and we raised the values of the ones that have been suppressed. And that's what it looks like. And so here's the city as it was in 2019, and here's our experiment to see what would have happened if redlining hadn't happened. And so here they are next to each other. And so if we're putting a rough number on this, who knows what might have happened, but the number that we see is about $1 billion. So who's to say how close that is, but it goes to show that there's a tremendous amount of value that has been lost. And so in addition to redlining, which affected the residential property, there's also the 1-2 punch, the left hook of urban renewal. And so there's also this value that's been lost directly through building infrastructure or institutions, or just being torn down. So in this graph, one of the things I wanted to show too is that this is the difference in footprint between what there was in 1930 and what it is today, how much more city there is now than there used to be, and how that footprint has been stretched out. And just this graph, another version of this graph came up today, so it's fun to see. Just showing the way in which the county continued to grow, has continued to grow during this time period, so that new influx in people moving out from the city, going out into the county. Though it was exciting to hear today, that trend is reversed now, and it's actually the city that's growing. Okay, so redlining left us with a lot of vacant lots. And so there's about 500 acres of these throughout South Bend. So that's what that looks like to scale. And here's an idea of what they look like. There we go. Oops. I overclicked. Come on now. Okay, and so if we take our just gonna click slowly now. Okay, and so one of the things that we find, that someone asked this question earlier today, and I was really excited because I get to answer it later, is that yes, we do see this big correlation between the areas of the city that were excluded from the financial system and where vacant lots are because of that cycle of disinvestment. And these two that that Joe actually drew shapes over is because these aren't even vacant lots. They're just demolished. There's just a lot of stuff just gone there. It doesn't even show up in our modeling. Like the parcels have been changed and everything. And so we take all those vacant lots and we look at our adjusted for inflation values to try and get a sense of how much money might have been lost. Something like $170 million. Okay, I'm just going to skip past this. There's also a lot of vacant industrial land. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a little closer look at one of these neighborhoods to think about what it would mean to try to, if we were to be able to put some of these houses back. So we'll look at this little rectangle in particular, and there's about 287 vacant lots in this rectangle, collectively worth a little less than $1 million. And there are about 236 occupied lots, the average value of $31,000, so still a very modest, probably suppressed value there, but it's still 10 times as much as a vacant lot, which for one thing shows us the importance of trying to buttress existing properties and keeping them from slipping into foreclosure and vacancy and being torn down. But here's some figures that come out of that. Even with that 30,000 number, if you filled all of them in, you'd have $8.8 million. Just building one house would be the equivalent of 10 of those vacant lots. And if you could get 28 houses built, it would double the value of this whole rectangle. And of course, that's the issue we run into with that is that has been discussed all day is that no one is really building any houses for $30,000 anymore. And so the dilemma to be overcome is how do we get construction there and overcome the appraisal gap and all of the barriers, the appraisal gap and also the affordability gap for people to be able to afford these houses. And that's where I want to end with today. But before that, I'm not done at all. I'm just going to come back to that. Oops. I also wanted to leave this image in here as a reminder of when this was a more aspirational time, and these were new lots with new infrastructure ready for people to come grab them because we're sort of back there. And this was a thriving, vibrant neighborhood at one point. That was supposed to be a picture, so I think this might be an old version of this, but I'll tell you about it anyways. There's this is a report from, it supports a initiative to do a highway cap in a neighborhood called Rondo in St. Paul, which was a heavily redlined neighborhood that has a highway going right through the middle of it. And they did a really good study to quantify the effects of generational wealth and how redlining not only destroyed value in that moment, but also reverberated down through generations to try and put a number to it. And so I also want to look at some of the intervention that's happened. And so this is the vertical is value per acre, and red to blue is the change in value from 2016 to 2019. And so in the near northwest neighborhood, we know there was a lot of interventions that happened to try to stabilize the neighborhood. And we can see it. We can see how value is sort of stretched out from where there's a stable market already. And likewise, we can see that where things have just carried on as they were, the market as it is, the financial system as it is not improving things here. So the good news is we can do things and they can work. So another experiment that I wanted to do is just too tempting, is that since we have this sort of two versions of South Bend, 1930 and today, I wanted to compare them to see how affordable was infrastructure back in 1930. And so we have this sort of same number of people, but one with this footprint and one with this footprint. So 230 miles of road versus 500. And so if we take here's the cost model with 2019 values, and so just cut off at that 1930 footprint, versus if we have those If we go back and we put back in those adjusted for inflation 1930 numbers, now we also have a South Bend with less infrastructure and more revenue. And so we'll go back to this neighborhood and see how it becomes positive. And so comparing the two, here you are, you run out of gas in Scottsburg, but back in 1930, you were only trying to get to Kentucky, and you almost make it. And so you could afford maybe 78% of your roads back then. Do you really want to go to Kentucky? I don't know. Okay, so we've talked about the impact of past policy. What I want to talk about now is the legacy and the vestigial impacts of redlining and all the other policies in the way that our current, as I said, big complicated systems are continuing to cause some harm. And so Indiana is a heavily property tax dependent state. We have to, one of the things we have to do is understand the property tax system in every state so we can see where are these threads being pulled that have an impact. And so North Carolina's got a really simple tax system. Maybe it's the only way that I learned how to do this work in the first place is from that. But in Indiana, what goes along with being a very property tax dependent state, unfortunately, like it is in Oregon, is that the state likes to meddle. And so there are a lot of policies and distortions and programs that alter how property tax actually makes it into your revenue. So there are all of these deductions that are possible, but one of the things they all have in common is you have to own the property to qualify for it. And I think for pretty much all of them have to own it and live in it, which excludes a huge percent of the population, a lot of the most vulnerable people. And so the way your tax system's pretty simple too, other than these weird programs, it's pretty much market value, take the deductions out, tax bill. But you also have this thing called the circuit breaker, which limits the amount of tax revenue you can get from different kinds of property. Again, notable, the lowest option is for owner-occupied housing. And it's just showing how that works. And so if not for these deductions and modifications, this is what your model would look like. It's much spikier here, and you'd be able to collect taxes on $4 billion worth of value. But this is how it actually works out. When you take all the deductions into account, it drops down to 2.7 billion. And so we look at it side by side. Here's what things are actually worth, but here's what you get to collect. There it is, up and down. So look at what that looks like on one property. So this is a house valued at $200,000, but it's getting these different deductions, and so it drops down to $100,000. So what we did is we made a map of the taxes that would be paid if everything were paid versus what's actually being paid, and you can see house by house it varies. And so all summed up, if you were able to collect all of the taxes that you could collect, you would get $150 million, but 50 million of that is lost to deductions. And I think a better way to do that in any of these programs, any state, any city, would, instead of taking it out of what people pay, would be to collect it all and write checks to people back so that people have a better understanding that what they're getting is a subsidy. Okay. And so, okay, here's the total value, what it would be. So another way to look at it is, here's the percent of taxes actually paid. So this is, we'll take all the commercial stuff out because commercial doesn't get any special deal unless it's a TIF or something. And what we started to see is that different parts of the city are paying different percents of their tax bill. And so where this gets interesting, I almost wish we could send out letters to everybody to tell them what all their neighbors pay in taxes. So these houses are across the street from each other. This one's worth $80,000, this one's worth $130,000. But when we take into account deductions, this one's actually paying less tax than their neighbor across the street. This one doesn't change at all. In all likelihood, it's probably a rental house, or maybe someone just doesn't know about the paperwork. But either way, there's this unevenness between neighborhoods. And so here's the circuit breaker, different types of property and the tax rates they get to pay. And so another thing that's really interesting is within one neighborhood, we've got this mix, Summit 2, Summit 1, most likely all these 2s are rental houses. So think about that too, between the lack of deductions and the higher tax cap rate, rental houses get to pass along more tax bill to the renters, who were, really probably the most vulnerable people in the community, or end up paying that bill. And so, okay, we take your 150 million, you could get 50 goes to deductions, another 16 goes to circuit breaker, so you end up with 80 million. Okay, so we talked about the tax distortions in Indiana, and earlier today we've talked a lot about appraising, but one of the things that we're just starting to look at in Asheville, in North Carolina, where our office is the assessment system itself and lingering bias in that. And so basically what we mean by that is, in the assessment system, so we're what we're talking about, take all the information about property, it goes into a computer, compares it to a bunch of stuff, spits out a value. But there's still a human in the process monitoring that and using the tools. So the reason this is such a big deal in Asheville and Buncombe County, where Asheville is because they both among the first communities to adopt reparations legislation. And so this was a big deal. It was in New York Times and lots of newspapers. And sure enough, in the language of the legislation, it addresses all of these problems that we've been talking about. It addresses generational wealth and redlining and all these things, the disinvestment, all these things that were done to certain parts of the city. And so we started looking at that. And so here's the redlining map for Asheville, because one of the things that's been going on is that property values have been rising more in the red line neighborhoods than in the not red line neighborhoods. And when we look at that in terms of land value, it's extremely pronounced that we've got in the red line neighborhoods of 14 times the value they had in 2000. So this is part of a national trend. This is from a New York Times article from the work of Professor Chris Berry. And what he's been looking at is the percent of assessment at the low and high end of the value scale. So basically, houses at the low end of the scale, low valued houses, are being assessed at or more than their market value, and at the other end, the very highest, mansions basically, are being assessed less than what their market value turns out to be. And so we decided to take a look in Buncombe County and see, well, is that happening in Asheville? So here's what we found. So this is a pretty humble, not wealthy looking home in Asheville. And this is just how the tax system works. The assessor guessed $209,000 for this. In North Carolina, it's really simple. Market assessed value is just market value. And when a house sells, there's this great opportunity to see how good of a job did we do as assessors, because we want to see that we said it was worth this much and it sold for that much. And so the tool for measuring that is the assessment ratio, the basically just assessed divided by selling. So in this case, we're 16% over. That's not so good. The band, what we usually, in the standard in assessing, is to try to stay within 10%. So 16%, okay, maybe we should try a little harder. So let's look at some more houses. So this one, not looking so great. It's got a big crack in the foundation. Assessor said 105. It sold for 85, so we're 24% over. It's like the price is right. This one, they said 190, it sold for 150, 27% over. 46% over. 23% over. This one doesn't look like the last ones. This one looks like all of the last ones stuck together and fixed up. And so assessor guessed 1.2 million, it sold for 2.4 million. Double what it was assessed for. So we're guessing a little low on these. Let's look at another one. This one's 68% of what it was assessed for. I'm sorry, I'm doing this backwards now. It sold for much more than it was assessed for. Only 58% of the market value. Now this one, I can look at that and say, there's no way that's worth $670,000 in Asheville. And whoever bought it agrees with me. They paid $1.2 million for it. So again, about 50% of what of the market value. And so this, these are all pretty consistent, about half of what they should be worth. Since we put them on a scatter plot, here's all the houses we just looked at, and it looks a lot like what Chris Berry found, that at this end of the scale, all of these humble houses are being assessed more than 100%, and all of these wealthy houses are being assessed at less than 100%. And so we look at that for all of the properties that sold. What we find is that basically when those humble houses are overassessed, it means all those taxes they've paid in the last few years, they've been overpaying a little bit. And all of these mansions that are assessed under what they sold for, they're basically getting a subsidy. And so between the two, it works out to about $5.5 million. Now this is just for a few houses that we looked at. We expanded this to look at all the houses that sold in Asheville that year and to figure out within all of those mansions where we're losing out on 50% of the tax revenue, what does that actually add up to? And it turned out to be $100 million. So to put that in perspective, I don't know if anyone has been to Asheville or familiar with the Biltmore estate, but this is a really big house that we have in Asheville that Vanderbilt built that's like a tourist attraction, and it's worth $40 million. So there's basically 2 Biltmore estates worth of value locked up in those mansions that just wasn't assessed. There's taxes just not collected. The reason this is such a big deal for Asheville is because of that, because we have that legislation to do reparations. Now we're in this awkward position of the people who are supposed to get the reparations are also the ones who are expected to pay for it. Okay, and with that, the last slides in this are not what I meant for them to be, so we'll end here. What I really wanted to end on, I'll just tell you, is going back to that image of the neighborhood where we're talking about how do we get houses built. If there's one thing in here that I want to leave as a point of discussion, it's how can we think about that creatively? Because the systems that created that problem are unlikely to be the systems that are able to fix it. So we're going to have to come up with some new ones. And so I'm just going to throw out some crazy ideas that came to me while listening to other talks today. There's guaranteeing loans for houses, but what about, would it be crazy to just start a bank? Was there a way, my personal dream, especially going back to my very first slide, is there a way to, if pension funds are so excited about investing in property, investing in houses, is there a way to leverage that capital to get investment in South Bend? Okay, I'm done now. Well, we can do questions if we're good on time. I'm not sure if I went too far over.
We can do questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. There is a question.
So the most interesting part of this to me was the very end with the assessed value and how properties that are assessed the least are assessed somewhat accurately, not more, and then the more expensive the house, the less accurate it gets. And I can tell you that's happening here, just by spot checking houses. Is there any, in the research of the New York Times, is there any reason why that happens, or is it just simple like cronyism? People who have a lot of money can fight tax bills better than people who don't. Is there any reason why that's happening?
Yeah, we're trying to figure that out. So we did this work in Buncombe County, looking at this, and that we were able to get a grant to look at that for all of Western North Carolina. And some of the things that were in this, still figuring that out, but some of the things that we found, we certainly thought about that. Is there a reason we're not assessing the mansions this high? If there is, I think that it's more psychological, that assessors, that it's a big number. And so we're like, oh, $2 million, I don't know, I might get in trouble if I put that down. Basically, those mansions they should be in a different category from all of the regular housing, because they're worth so much more. And it's just, I think there's a reversion to the mean that's happening, that for the low houses, they don't really think too much about like, oh yeah, add $25,000 to that. That's not that much money. Or whereas adding $1 million to a house is kind of scary. The other thing that came out of that, is coming out of that research, is that a lot of the assessors are just underfunded. They just don't have a lot of resources, so they're not really doing the best job they could be. And so one of the things that we suggested, and apparently, like, this is pretty new news, is the county might actually do, is we said, why don't you hire, just spend, say, $100,000 and look at just these mansions, because it will pay for itself. Like, you will get that money back. And so they are going to do that. And some of it is just, it hasn't been looked at very closely yet. But yeah, we don't totally know yet. Yes?
That phenomenon is endemic. I audited for 30 years. That's endemic throughout the tax system. If you audit low-income people, they pay more, it's easier audit. High-income people, they got lawyers, they got accountants, it's harder. And the problem with thinking in cronyism is it's everywhere. I audited in Kansas City. Found the same thing.
Actually, yeah, I'll get you in just a second, because you reminded me of something, is that, yeah, to be fair, one of the things, there's the appeals board, so when people fight their taxes and it goes to a group of people who are supposed to decide, oh, should this be fought or not? We found out, one, is that's a very opaque system in Buncombe County, and when we did find out who was on it, it turned out at least 3 of them are like realtors for like Christie's, and so like luxury realtors, basically. So what are the odds how are they going to treat a tax appeal for a mansion? Okay.
Your start a bank idea in the end, so who's done it and how has it worked out? Has everybody done it?
I don't know. It's just mostly just a crazy idea right now. So I don't know much how do you start a bank, but I just really like the idea, because there are a lot of investments and loans that could be made that I think would be good loans, not just beneficial, but would be good loans, better than some of the things that the regular banking system invests in. And so if we could just evaluate risk differently, I think it could go a long way. Plus, I really like the idea of that money coming back to the community to be invested. I think the closest thing I can think of is infrastructure banks, but we haven't done a very good job with those in this country. So unfortunately, I think that's still pretty theoretical, or I just don't know enough about it. Where's the... Oh.
There used to be state banks whose mission was to reinvest in, I think there's only one, I think I saw this on 60 Minutes one time, there's only one state bank left in the United States, in South Dakota or North Dakota, I think.
Huh.
And their mission is to just reinvest in that state and the community. So it does have that effect. All the others have disappeared.
Los Angeles tried to do it to deal with cannabis revenue, but they made it a referendum instead, so they asked people what they thought, and it didn't go through.
There's something called a community development credit union, and you can develop those. We did that in Kansas City. They're going to cut the ribbon on it on December 1st, but it did take 13 years to get it funded. But yes, you can create a bank, a community development credit union, that will make the loans that you need to make within your community.
Where's the funding coming from?
What? Oh, they got grants, they got philanthropy and so forth as seed money, and then the example that was given today where the lady in the green put up her hand and said, well, I want to buy it, and he wants to sell it, and, you know, is she going to make the loan? Yeah, she's probably going to make the loan if somebody would lend her the money. So what you find, you know, you need the seed money, but after that, it's a bank. It works the same way all other banks do.
Hey.
I was wondering if you had any
questions or had been able to like zoom in on TIF districts and see if their value or if you feel like that's a good idea for cities trying to incentivize certain areas?
Yeah, okay. I don't remember what we looked at in South Bend for TIF. I was trying to cover a lot of bases, but since Kansas City just came up, I remember a lot of TIF from Kansas City. And there's a way, TIFs are so funny, they're so controversial. Because they can be abused. And Kansas City's got both examples. It's got good and bad examples. Like, what was it? When we did that one, we called them the good witch and the bad witch, the good TIF and the bad TIF. And so I think they can be incredibly powerful tools. And the ones that I like best are for, when I had those examples of the buildings that have been paying taxes for 100 years, I like the idea of those getting TIFs as like a birthday present. Like, hey, you've been paying taxes for 100 years. Here's this little birthday party. Have a TIF so you can keep paying taxes for another 100 years. Especially since those buildings have already proved that they're going to be around. The ones I don't like so much are, I don't know why I remember this so well from Kansas City, but they also have done ones that are like the very first, I think the very first modern mall ever built was in Kansas City, Blue Ridge Mall. And it went through the life cycle of a mall. It got killed by a fancier mall. And then they're like, what do we do with this thing? So they did a TIF for it and built a Walmart that had substantially less commercial square feet than the mall that it replaced. While it also has a set lifetime of like, that Walmart's only going to last like 20 years. So really, it's like, what benefit does that have? So I think when they're used wisely, they can be fantastic, but they're not always used wisely.
Talk about land value taxes, maybe like was just a way to address some of those issues. Are there places that you've studied or in the U.S. to kind of like work out some of the disparities between the high and the low and like the massive example that you showed of the Liberty Tower and the agency bank?
Yeah. There's those two pieces of that. One is the official part of what I've seen, which is they do that in Australia and New Zealand. They have land tax, and one of the fun things about that is that they call it rates, though, is that they're able to take into account not just what they want to do for taxation, but they actually, the costs that I talk about, all of those infrastructure costs, they can apply that in there too. And it's really funny, I remember reading in one of the explanations from New Zealand that it says, like, this is a rate that we apply everywhere, even in the rural parts of our community. And it's like, but isn't this regressive? And they're like, yes, it's supposed to be, because some things would consume too much infrastructure if we let them get built. And so that's one fun example. And then there's my own that it's another wild idea I've been trying to convince some city to do. I've come close a couple times, but I like this idea of what I call a speculation tax, especially so that example with the bank and and it's not a Holiday Inn anymore. It's called something else now. I saw Liberty Tower. Okay. And in those cases, what I'm interested in is we almost did this in Lancaster, California. They wanted to do something called a form-based fee. And what we said is like, okay, if you've already gone through the process to figure out like this is the kind of development we know we want to have and should have, especially in our downtown where we have a really intense infrastructure, why should we forego the tax revenue we should get for that just because you're sitting on your land with like maybe a parking lot? And so the idea would be, if there was a minimum in a downtown to say that we're going to charge as though everything is a 5-story building at least. And if you don't have that, if you're just a parking lot, well, you should be. And I think the carrot that would have to come with that, like I said, crazy ideas. But I think the carrot that would have to come with that is, in some cases, it's just speculation and somebody would move and say, okay, fine, now I'll make a deal. Some cases, someone might just not know what to do or know what to do next. So being able to take the revenue that comes from that or having a system be like, okay, we put this burden on you now. You don't know how to develop or you don't have the resources. How can we connect you to make a deal happen, because we'd rather actually have the 5-story building than just collect the money. But for big speculators, there's companies or institutions that just own land all over the place and have no motivation to do anything with it, you would at least get the revenue out of it. It would make a statement about what we're willing to accept in a community. Yes?
So, like in Asheville, when those houses sold for so much above, does the tax rate get adjusted then for what they bought the house for?
Oh, that's apparently that's a loaded question, because in the assessment world, there's this thing called sales chasing. So technically, you're really not supposed to do that, at least in North Carolina. So like in California, that happens automatically because it resets Prop 13. But in North Carolina, when a house sells, you're not supposed to automatically reassessment. It's only supposed to get reassessed if there's discovery of something new. So the idea is if it sells, they have to go say like, oh, it turns out you had a bathroom we didn't know about. Here's your new value. And so part of what we're dealing with now is to try to, like where we're encouraging the county to spend some more on assessing, is to go through and honestly, just go look through Redfin and see how many bathrooms there are and everything. Incomplete and inaccurate data is a big problem that they're dealing with. And so it does not reset, though Buncombe County has been doing that. Yes?
Okay, going back to redlining, in those particular neighborhoods where you have low-income households, and you have the residents picking up a burden, a higher burden, if you're redeveloping those neighborhoods, what's the best type of structure would you put into that neighborhood? Would it be multifamily rather than single family? I mean, if you're trying to generate dollars, revenue to make up for what's lost.
Yes, okay, so I'm thinking how best to answer it. I would say if we go back to that diagram of the 4 houses getting more and more compact, that lesson remains true. The more you can get on the leased land and the leased infrastructure, the more financially beneficial it's going to be. Plus, it just makes more space. There's just, if you have more housing on the same land, 2 houses on a lot instead of 1, it's more revenue, but it's also more space for people. But as far as like type, like multifamily, single family, all that, I would leave that to a discussion of design, because I think I get nervous about saying this type is, or I get nervous about saying any type of development or any density is the right answer. So much is more is better, as long as it's well designed and makes sense in the context. Is that a helpful answer, or should I elaborate?
Yeah, it helps. I mean, this whole presentation has been helpful. And I'm asking that question because on the west side, in those red line areas, Kennedy Park, LaSalle Park, you hear of single-family housing all the time, the need for single-family housing. But based on what I'm taking away from the presentation, it sounds like more, if it's more housing in a particular area, it doesn't necessarily need to be single-family housing. It could be multi-purpose.
Yeah, and so, and I'm gonna. This is my answer as an urbanist, as someone who loves cities and places, and to say that a variety and an ecosystem of all different kinds of housing types is good, because then you've got choices, and it's not as interesting if it's just one, monoculture of a type of housing. It's nice to have a few things and have some commercial in there too. Things can evolve and change. And so and this is the way, I think that's what our neighborhoods used to look like, and they used to function, is to have that variety. And the idea I'm really excited about is, I think the Incremental Development Alliance has spent some time here, right? Yeah, and so one of the ideas I'm excited about too is when people in neighborhoods are able to sort of expand their property and add on to it and do small scale development so that one house can sort of evolve into 2 and then evolve into 4 and then add a shop or something. It's, you know, what people used to do before we invented zoning. Yes.
In communities that have been historically disinvested, are there any cities that you've run into that protect the tax rate of the current residents? Because you come in and any of this investment raises the value, which is good because we want to raise the value. It's disinvested, but who gets to participate in that is sometimes also very uneven. And so you have people that are there that are participating where their value goes up, but they only see that value when they sell. So they're at high risk for displacement. Are there nationwide examples where those tax rates have been held, where the city or county would step in and incentivize them to stay?
Yeah, I've got a couple of things to say on that topic because this is a big dilemma. You know, this is what we see happen in a lot of places. And I'll say that most of the attempts that I've seen in different states to do that backfire because it's so easy for those tools to get really co-opted by, yeah, people who know how to find loopholes. And there's some that have been, so in North Carolina, in North Carolina too, there's a lot of limitations on what you can do with that. So the workaround in North Carolina has been to, instead of doing anything with the collecting tax, is to just write checks and just say, okay, we can identify people who are overburdened by their taxes, and we'll just write them a check to help pay for it. But then, and once we started looking at it too, we started realizing, well, why don't we just tax everyone properly? And when we tax the mansions better to offset that. The other example that I'm excited about is what we're seeing happening in a lot of formerly red line neighborhoods with the. I get to talk about Mayor Pete for a second with the new direction with restorative infrastructure. And so some of the proposals that are coming out of that initiative, like the Reconnecting Rondo highway cap, are also bundled with proposals to put decision-making about new development, but also the revenue from new development into the neighborhood, and to do it in a collective way, so that Rondo is looking at that, and there's another one called Destination Crenshaw in Los Angeles, which could potentially be very lucrative because it coincides with a new subway station. And so the idea would be the members of the community, whether they own property or not, have a stake, and they get to say, yes, upzone this like crazy, or maybe not. But if it is, the proceeds of that are going to fall in the community, and also ideally, I think, help offset the burden, or at least everyone gets a big paycheck.
All right. Good discussion.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a wonderful symposium. I learned a lot, and South Bend's just cool.
Well, Josh, thank you for being here. And everyone, just wanted to say there are half sheets as you head out, and they've got a number of dates for different ways you can engage with us through the comp plan process, in conversations about housing, and a number of other things. So please grab a sheet. As far as South Bend 2045 and the next opportunity to engage, we'll have a public workshop on November 15th starting at 6 p.m., and that'll be at Howard Park, the Howard Park Event Center. So that's the indoor space at the park. So hope to see you there. Thank you so much for coming out. And Josh, thank you for this great presentation.